She was 12. He was 40. And the ceremony was only the beginning. In medieval Europe, marriage wasn't a union. It was a sentence. Daughters were sold in silk, gifted to strangers, and used to buy peace between warring men. From public bedding rituals to deadly childbirth, this was no fairy tale. It was a system where blood, gold, and silence forged alliances and buried countless women in the process. What price did they pay for love they never chose? Let's uncover the tragic truth of medieval matrimony. In the twilight of medieval Europe, where candlelight flickered against stone and plague haunted every hearth, marriage was no tender bond, but a crucible of power and peril. From the 12th to the 15th centuries, across the courts of England, France, and beyond, unions were forged not by love, but by the cold calculus of wealth, land, and lineage. Daughters, often mere children, were traded as tokens in a high-stakes game, their futures sealed by ink and ambition. Behind the grandeur of wedding feasts and the sanctity of church vows lurked a grim reality, a system that stripped women of agency, binding them to lives of submission, danger, and sacrifice. This is not the romance of chivalric tales, but a shadowed chronicle of human cost. A tale of innocence sold, bodies broken, and spirits tested by a world that valued alliance over humanity. What truths lie buried in these forgotten vows? The journey into this darkness begins now. In the shadowed corridors of medieval courts, where bloodlines were currency and ambition rarely answered to morality, the destinies of children, particularly daughters, were negotiated with cold calculation. These young lives were not their own, but shaped by family survival, noble aspirations, and the ever-shifting currents of power. Girls scarcely old enough to pronounce their titles were bound to men they had never met, in marriages not of sentiment, but of statecraft. Lands were secured, enemies pacified, debts settled, not with gold, but with the futures of the very young. Such was the early path of Margaret Beaufort, heiress to the vast Beaufort fortune and descended from royal blood. In 1444, at just 6 years old, she became the subject of a political transaction orchestrated by her guardians, married to John de la Pole, a boy also of noble birth. The union was not consummated, nor even truly enacted, but it was a formal entanglement of estates and allegiances. Margaret, too young to grasp the ceremony that bound her, was little more than a silent figure in the ambitions of adults who saw her not as a child, but as an asset to be leveraged. Her name, her inheritance, and her womb were pledged long before her voice had strength. By age 9, shifting political winds rendered the alliance inconvenient, and the marriage was annulled as expediently as it had been arranged. Yet this brief reprieve only underscored a larger truth. Margaret's autonomy was irrelevant. At 12, she was remarried, this time to Edmund Tudor, a man of rising influence and a half-brother to the king. The match was engineered with urgency, meant to secure Tudor interests in a turbulent landscape. Though the legal union aligned with the norms of the age, its rapid consummation and Margaret's subsequent pregnancy placed her in peril both physically and emotionally. Still on the cusp of adolescence, she was thrust into the responsibilities of womanhood, not by choice, but by decree. Her body endured what her years should have spared, and though she survived, the toll would echo throughout her life. Margaret would never again bear a child. Yet from that single, fraught birth would come Henry Tudor, later King Henry VII, whose ascent would end the Wars of the Roses and found the Tudor dynasty. Margaret herself, hardened by experience and sharpened by necessity, would evolve into one of the most formidable political actors of her time. She founded colleges, negotiated alliances, and shaped the future of England from behind the throne. But beneath her legacy lies a childhood shaped less by affection than by strategy, and a youth defined not by innocence, but by the demands of power. Her story, though singular in its historical impact, mirrored the silent fate of countless girls across medieval Europe, each caught in the machinery of inheritance, sacrifice, and control. Behind every noble title, every alliance forged at the altar, there often stood a child whose life had been charted not by dreams, but by treaties and threats. And though their voices were rarely recorded, their stories are etched into the very fabric of medieval politics, a quiet testament to the cost of dynastic ambition. Nor was Margaret's plight singular. In 1396, Isabella of Valois, a mere 6 years and 5 days old, was wed to King Richard II of England. Her trousseau, adorned with dolls and miniature silver furniture, poignant symbols of a childhood stolen. The contract forbade consummation until her 12th year, yet the ceremony branded her as property, her royal blood a currency in a diplomatic game. These were not aberrations, but the calculated machinations of a society where daughters were economic assets, their worth measured in acres and titles. The Church, guardian of morality, set rules on consummation ages, but turned a blind eye when power was at stake, its silence complicit in the commodification of innocence. Parents, navigating a world of wars and plagues, saw early marriages as a bulwark against chaos, yet their pragmatism bore a cruel cost. For every Margaret or Isabella, childhood ended not with time, but with a contract, their futures tethered to the ambitions of others. Yet this was but the opening chapter of their ordeal, for the marriage bed awaited with its own horrors. In the flickering torchlight of medieval halls, where feasting gave way to ritual, the wedding night unfolded as a spectacle of intrusion and control, stripping bare the sanctity of intimacy. Far from a private union, the bedding ceremony transformed the marriage bed into a stage, its curtains parting for an audience of kin, courtiers, and clergy. The bride, often trembling with youth or fear, was escorted by women who stripped her of her gown, combed her hair, and offered whispered counsel on duties she could scarcely fathom. The groom, too, was paraded by his fellows, their jests cloaking the gravity of what was to come. Together, they were ushered into bed, a priest's blessing invoking fertility, while guests hurled stockings in a bizarre rite, each toss a mocking bid for matrimonial luck. For high nobility, such as Margaret of York, in her 1468 union with Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, the ritual was a grand affair, with noble witnesses lingering to verify consummation, their presence ensuring the alliance's legal weight. This was no mere tradition, but a stark reminder of marriage as a contract, its validity hinging on a public act. Consummation sealed inheritance rights and political pacts. Without it, the union could be annulled, alliances shattered. In the case of young Isabella of Valois, wed at 6 to Richard II, the ceremony, though symbolic until her 12th year, etched her status as chattel into the annals of court. Even in less extreme cases, the bedding rite varied by region, from symbolic farewells in some locales to legally mandated displays in Scandinavian lands. Yet for all its pomp, the ritual was a mechanism of control, stripping couples of dignity and branding women, especially child brides, as vessels of duty. The Church, complicit once more, sanctified these intrusions, its blessings masking the violation of privacy. As the bed curtains closed, the weight of expectation lingered, a prelude to the mortal perils that awaited in the birthing chamber. In the shadowed chambers of medieval life, where hope flickered as faintly as a dying ember, childbirth stood as a grim sentinel, its arrival a perilous gamble with death. For women, particularly the young brides of noble houses, pregnancy was no blessing, but a harrowing trial, each labor a roll of fate's cruel dice. Margaret Beaufort, wed at 12 to Edmund Tudor, faced this ordeal at 13, her frail body scarcely formed when she bore a son in 1457. Widowed by plague and forced to journey through winter's bite to Pembroke Castle, her labour was so torturous that, as her confessor, Bishop John Fisher, recorded, it was a miracle she survived. Yet the cost was dire. The trauma rendered her sterile, her body broken by a single birth, a scar that lingered through 2 further marriages. Such was the common lot. Isabella of Aragon, though spared the indignity of childhood betrothal, met her end at 18, her body ravaged by days of agonizing labor, despite the futile ministrations of herbalists and prayers. Medieval medicine, steeped in ignorance, offered bloodletting and crude birthing chairs, tools that hastened harm rather than healing. 1 in 3 women perished in childbirth, or its aftermath. Their odds, grimmer than a knight's on the battlefield. Noble women, tasked with producing heirs, faced relentless pressure, enduring 8 to 15 pregnancies, each a potential death knell. Eleanor of Aquitaine, a titan of her age, survived 10 such trials, but most were not so fortunate, their bodies worn to ruin by the ceaseless demand for sons. For young brides, their undeveloped frames bore unimaginable strain, their pain a silent testament to a society that prized lineage over life. Yet even survival offered no respite, for the law granted husbands dominion over their wives' very existence. In the iron grip of medieval law, where justice bent to the will of men, a wife was no more than a shadow of her husband's dominion, her life subject to his whim. The doctrine of reasonable chastisement granted husbands the right to discipline their wives with impunity. A stick, no thicker than a thumb, deemed a permissible tool of correction. Such vague boundaries cloaked brutality and legality, leaving women ensnared in a system that stripped them of agency. The reign of Henry VIII, straddling the twilight of the medieval age, laid bare this grim truth. Anne Boleyn, his second queen, faced execution in 1536, condemned for adultery, incest, and treason, charges woven from whispers, her failure to produce a male heir her true crime. Catherine Howard, barely 19, met a similar fate. Her youth, no shield against fabricated accusations that served her husband's desires. Both were dispatched to the scaffold, their deaths not aberrations, but the lawful culmination of a system that equated a wife's disobedience with treachery. Beyond the royal court, countless women endured silent torments. Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester, was tortured and imprisoned with her husband's acquiescence, her crime merely political inconvenience. Divorce, a distant dream, required proof of non-consummation through humiliating examinations, a process so costly and protracted that few could pursue it. A married woman, stripped of legal identity, could neither own property nor testify without her husband's consent. If he chose to confine her to a tower or wield lethal force, the law offered no recourse. Accusations of witchcraft or infidelity could be conjured to dispose of an inconvenient wife. Medieval courts blind to due process when power was at stake. These women, many entering marriage with full knowledge of their powerlessness, faced a stark choice: submission or ruin. Yet even this bleak existence was transient, for death, ever present, loomed as both a threat and a perverse promise of release. In the shadowed annals of medieval Europe, marriage was no sanctuary of love, but a crucible where innocence was forged into sacrifice. The tales of Margaret Beaufort, Isabella of Valois, and countless others unveil a world where women were chattels, their lives bartered for power, their bodies broken by duty, their spirits bound by laws that offered no mercy. These were not mere personal tragedies, but the workings of a system that commodified human lives, where vows were sealed not in affection, but in the cold ink of contracts. Yet amidst this bleak tapestry, some women wove threads of resilience, navigating a merciless world with cunning and endurance. Their stories, etched in pain, whisper a timeless truth. Power, unchecked, consumes both the wielder and the wielded. Today, as the echoes of those vows fade, one may ponder the fragility of freedom and the cost of progress. To delve deeper into history's shadowed truths, subscribe, share, and reflect on the price paid for alliances long forgotten. In the silence of their graves, these women's voices linger, a haunting reminder of a world where love was a luxury none could afford.